But is criticism really a creative art? Why should it not be? It works with materials and puts them into a form that is at once new and delightful. What more can one say of poetry? Indeed, I would call criticism a creation within a creation. For just as the great artists, from Homer and Aeschylus down to Shakespeare and Keats, did not go directly to life for their subject matter, but sought for it in myth and legend and ancient tale, so the critic deals with materials that others have, as it were, purified for him, and to which imaginative form and color have already been added. Nay, more, I would say that the highest criticism, being the purest form of personal impression, is in its own way more creative than creation, as it has least reference to any standard external to itself, and is, in fact, its own reason for existing, and, as the Greeks would put it, in itself and to itself an end. Certainly it is never trammelled by any shackles of verisimilitude, no ignoble considerations of probability, that cowardly concession to the tedious repetitions of domestic or public life affect it ever. One may appeal from fiction unto fact, but from the soul there is no appeal. From the soul? Yes, from the soul. That is what the highest criticism really is, the record of one's own soul. It is more fascinating than history, as it is concerned simply with oneself. It is more delightful than philosophy, as its subject is concrete and not abstract, real and not vague. It is the only civilized form of autobiography, as it deals not with the events, but with the thoughts of one's life. Not with the life's physical accidents of deed or circumstance, but with the spiritual moods and imaginative passions of the mind. I am always amused by the silly vanity of those writers and artists of our day who seem to imagine that the primary function of the critic is to chatter about their second-rate work. The best that one can say of most modern creative art is that it is just a little less vulgar than reality, and so the critic, with his fine sense of distinction and sure instinct of delicate refinement, will prefer to look into the silver mirror or through the woven veil, and will turn his eyes away from the chaos and clamor of actual existence. Though the mirror be tarnished and the veil be torn, his sole aim is to chronicle his own impressions. It is for him that pictures are painted, books written, and marble hewn into form. I seem to have heard another theory of criticism. Yes, it has been said by one whose gracious memory we all revere, and the music of whose pipe once lured Proserpina from her Sicilian fields, and made those white feet stir, and not in vain, the Cumnor cowslips, that the proper aim of criticism is to see the object as in itself it really is. But this is a very serious error, and takes no cognizance of criticism's most perfect form, which is in its essence purely subjective, and seeks to reveal its own secret and not the secret of another. For the highest criticism deals with art not as expressive, but as impressive purely. But is that really so? Of course it is. Who cares whether Mr. Ruskin's views on Turner are sound or not? What does it matter? That mighty and majestic prose of his, so fervid and so fiery-colored in its noble eloquence, so rich in its elaborate symphonic music, so sure and certain at its best in subtle choice of word and epithet, is at least as great a work of art as any of those wonderful sunsets that bleach or rot in their corrupted canvases in England's gallery. Greater indeed, one is apt to think at times, not merely because its equal beauty is more enduring, but on account of the fuller variety of its appeal, soul speaking to soul in those long cadenced lines, not through form and color alone, but through tense, indeed, completely and without loss, but with intellectual and emotional utterance, with lofty passion and with loftier thought, with imaginative insight and with poetic aim. Greater, I always think, even as literature is the greater art. Who again cares whether Mr. Pater has put into the portrait of Mona Lisa something that Leonardo never dreamed of? The painter may have been merely the slave of an archaic smile, as some have fancied, but whenever I pass into the cool galleries of the Palace of the Louvre, and stand before that strange figure set in its marble chair, in that cirque of fantastic rocks as in some faint light under the sea, I murmur to myself, she is older than the rocks among which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times, and learned the secrets of the grave, and has been a diver in deep seas, and keeps their fallen day about her, and trafficked for strange webs with Eastern merchants, and as Leda with the mother of Helen of Troy, and Saint Anne the mother of Mary, and all that has been to her, but as the sounds of lyres and flutes, and lives only in the delicacy with which it has moulded the changing lineaments, and tinged the eyelids of the hands. And I say to my friend, the presence that thus so strangely rose beside the waters is expressive of what in the ways of 1,000 years men had come to desire. And he answers me, hers is the head upon which all the ends of the world are come, and the eyelids are a little weary. And so the picture becomes more wonderful to us than it really is, and reveals to us a secret of which in truth knows nothing, and the music of the mystical prose is as sweet in our ears as was that flute player's music that lent to the lips of La Gioconda those subtle and poisonous curves. Do you ask me what Leonardo would have said had anyone told him of his picture, that all the thoughts and experience of the world had etched and molded therein that which they had power to refine and make expressive the outward form, the animalism of Greece, the lust of Rome, the reverie of the Middle Ages with its spiritual ambition and imaginative loves, the return of the pagan world, the sins of the Borgias? He would probably have answered that he had contemplated none of those things, but had concerned himself simply with the certain arrangements of lines and masses, and with new and curious color harmonies of blue and green. And it is for this very reason that the criticism which I have quoted is criticism of the highest kind. It treats the work of art simply as a starting point for a new creation. It does not confine itself, let us at least suppose for the moment, to discover the real intention of the artist and accepting that as final, and in this it is right, for the meaning of any beautiful created thing is at least as much in the soul of him who looks at it, as it was in the soul who wrought it. Nay, it is rather the beholder who lends to the beautiful thing its myriad meanings, and sets it in some new relation to the age, so that it becomes a vital portion of our lives, and a symbol of what we pray for, or perhaps of what, having prayed for, we fear that we may receive. The longer I study Ernest, the more clearly I see that the beauty of the visible arts is, as the beauty of music, impressive primarily, and that it may be marred, and indeed often is so, by any excess of intellectual intention on the part of the artist. For when the work is finished, it has, as it were, an independent life of its own, and may deliver a message far other than that which was put into its lips to say. Sometimes when I listen to the overture of Tannhauser, I seem indeed to see that comely knight treading delicately on the flower-strewn grass, and to hear the voice of Venus calling to him from the caverned hill, but at other times it speaks to me of 1,000 different things, of myself it may be, in my own life, or of the lives of others whom one has loved and grown weary of loving, or of the passions that man has known, or of the passions that man has not known, and so has sought for. Tonight it may fill one with that question, that armour de l'impossible, which falls like a madness on many who think they live securely and out of reach of harm, so that they sicken suddenly with the poison of unlimited desire, and in the infinite pursuit of what they may not obtain, grow faint and swoon or stumble. Tomorrow, like the music of which Aristotle and Plato tell us, the noble Dorian music of the Greek, it may perform the office of a physician, and give us an anodyne against pain, and heal the spirit that is wounded, and bring the soul into harmony with all right things. And what is true about music is true about all the arts. Beauty has many meanings as man has moods. Beauty is the symbol of symbols. Beauty reveals everything because it expresses nothing. When it shows us itself, it shows us the whole fiery colored world. But is such work as you have talked about really criticism? It is the highest criticism, for it criticizes not merely the individual work of art, but beauty itself, and fills with wonder a form which the artist may have left void, or not understood, or understood incompletely. The highest criticism, then, is more creative than creation, and the primary aim of the critic is to see the object as in itself it really is not. That is your theory, I believe? Yes, that is my theory. To the critic, the work of art is simply a suggestion for a new work of art of his own, that need not necessarily bear any obvious resemblance to the thing it criticizes. The one characteristic of a beautiful form is that one can put into it whatever one wishes, and see in it whatever one chooses to see, and the beauty that gives to creation its universal and aesthetic element makes the critic a creator in his turn, and whispers of 1,000 different things which were not present in the mind of him who carved the statue or painted the panel or graved the gem. It is sometimes said by those who understand neither the nature of the highest criticism nor the charm of the highest art that the pictures that the critic loves the most to write about are those that belong to the anecdotage of painting, and that deal with scenes taken out of literature or history. But this is not so. Indeed, pictures of this kind are far too intelligible. As a class they rank with illustrations, and, even considered from this point of view, are failures, as they do not stir the imagination, but set definite bounds to it. For the domain of the painter is, as I suggested before, widely different from that of the poet. To the latter belongs life in its full and absolute entirely, not merely the beauty that men look at, but the beauty that men listen to also, not merely the momentary grace of form or the transient gladness of color, but the whole sphere of feeling, the perfect cycle of thought. The painter is so far limited that it is only through the mask of the body that he can show us the mystery of the soul, only through conventional images that he can handle ideas, only through its physical equivalence that he can deal with psychology. And how inadequately does he do it then, asking us to accept the torn turban of the Moor for the noble rage of Othello, or a dotard in a storm for the wild madness of Lear? Yet it seems as if nothing could stop him. Most of our elderly English painters spend their wicked and wasted lives in poaching upon the domain of the poets, marring their motives by clumsy treatment, and striving to render by visible form or color the marvel of what is invisible, the splendor of what is not seen. Their pictures are, as a natural consequence, insufferably tedious. They have degraded the invisible arts into the obvious arts, and the only thing not worth looking at is the obvious. I do not stand that poet and painter may not treat of the same subject. They have always done so and will always do so, but while the poet can be pictorial or not as he chooses, the painter must be pictorial always, for a painter is limited, not to what he sees in nature, but to what upon canvas may be seen. And so, my dear Ernest, pictures of this kind will not really fascinate the critic. He will turn from them to such works as make him brood and dream and fancy, to works that possess the subtle quality of suggestion, and seem to tell one that even from them there is an escape into a wider world. It is sometimes said that the tragedy of an artist's life is that he cannot realize his ideal, but the true tragedy that dogs the steps of most artists is that they realize their ideal too absolutely. For when the ideal is realized, it is robbed of its wonder and its mystery, and becomes simply a new starting point for an ideal that is other than itself. This is the reason why music is the perfect type of art. Music can never reveal its ultimate secret. This also is the explanation of the value of limitations in art. The sculptor gladly surrenders imitative color, and the painter the actual dimensions of form, because by such renunciations they are able to avoid too definite a presentation of the real, which would be mere imitation, and too definite a realization of the ideal, which would be too purely intellectual. It is through its very incompleteness that art becomes complete in beauty, and so addresses itself not to the faculty of recognition, nor to the faculty of reason, but to the aesthetic sense alone, which, while accepting both reason and recognitions as its stages of apprehension, subordinates them both to a pure synthetic impression of the work as a whole, and taking whatever alien emotional elements the work may possess, uses their very complexity as a means by which a richer unity may be added to the ultimate impression itself. You see, then, how it is that the aesthetic critic rejects those obvious modes of art that have but one message to deliver, and having delivered it become dumb and sterile, and seeks rather for modes as suggest reverie and mood, and by their imaginative beauty make all interpretations true, and no interpretation final. Some resemblance, no doubt, the creative work of the critic will have to the work that has stirred him to creation, but it will be such resemblance as exists, not between nature and the mirror that the painter of landscape or figure may be supposed to hold up to her, but between nature and the work of the decorative artist. Just as on the flowerless carpets of Persia, tulip and rose blossom indeed and are lovely to look on, though they are not reproduced in visible shape or line, just as the pearl and purple of the seashell is echoed in the church of St. Mark at Venice, just as the vaulted ceiling of the wondrous chapel at Ravenna is made gorgeous by the gold and green and sapphire of the peacock's tail, though the birds of Juno fly not across it, so the critic reproduces the work that he criticizes in a mode that is never imitative, and part of whose charm may really consist in the rejection of resemblance, and shows us in this way not merely the meaning but also the mystery of beauty, and by transforming each art into literature solves once and for all the problem of art's unity. But I see it is time for supper. After we have discussed some Chambertin and a few ortolans, we will pass on to the question of the critic considered in the light of the interpreter. Ah, you admit then that the critic may occasionally be allowed to see the object as in itself it really is. I am not quite sure. Perhaps I may admit it after supper. There is a subtle influence in supper.